Alright, this is video 1 for the notes. That would be for Tuesday, March 21st, which is would be ACT Day. So you can get these notes through this video and get us a little bit farther into Unit 11, so we won't be so far behind later this week. So we left off kind of with the fall of Indochina with Asia. So here, this is a picture of what Indochina used to look like. It was a French colony. It had Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam inside, so it's Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. That made up French Indochina. The French had controlled it since the 1800s until World War II, when the Japanese overran it. The French couldn't come get it, so the French had to give it up. The Japanese overran Indochina in the 1930s and 40s. Well, when they left, they tried to come reclaim it. The French wanted to come back and take it over. Except now you had people living inside of Indochina, the Vietnamese and other groups, who wanted to break off and become independent. They were tired of French imperialism and so on. So Ho Chi Minh becomes this leader of the Vietnamese who wants to break out and become free. Ho Chi Minh was this communist, this man right here, who had fought against the Japanese throughout the entire war. In fact, America gave money to Ho Chi Minh and some of the Vietnamese people to help fight against the Japanese there in his home territory. But he also had lived for a long period of time in China and was influenced by Mao and Marxist teachings and so on. So whenever the war ends, and World War II ends in 1945, he forms a resistance group to fight against the French so they can keep control over their own territory and become independent. But America did not want to let this happen. America decided that it actually wanted to give money to France so it can keep an imperialist system and keep these colonies, because Ho Chi Minh being communist, we didn't want Vietnam to become a communist country. This, of course, would violate containment. So in 1950, Truman began giving money and military aid to the French. We didn't give soldiers, but we gave money and military supplies to the French from 1950 until 1954. At the same time, the Soviets and Chinese were giving supplies to Ho Chi Minh. So Ho Chi Minh was receiving money from the Chinese government and the Soviet government in the north, whereas we were supporting the government in the south. And the way that, we were supporting the French government in the south, excuse me. Well, by 1954, the French had had enough. They had fought since 1945 until 1954 for about 10 years or so, and they decided enough was enough. They couldn't defeat the Vietnamese, so they gave out. The battle, you don't have to write this down, but the battle they lost at was at Dien Bien Phu. So in 1954, that was the battle that they lost out on, was in Dien Bien Phu. So the French decided to give it up. So America was involved in this as well too, since we had given so much aid to the French. And they held a convention in Geneva. So in 1954, there's a convention. I don't have this on the screen. There was a convention held in Geneva to basically decide what to do with Vietnam. They decided to do something similar to what had happened to Korea in the split in half. So in 1954, the French left. The French had left Vietnam. Vietnam gets split into two at the 17th parallel. So now Vietnam will be split in half at the 17th parallel. You can see here's North Vietnam, here's South Vietnam, because the North was going to be run by Ho Chi Minh, but the South had been very influenced by the French government, and they didn't want Ho Chi Minh and his people to be in charge of them, so they're split in half. So America is going to end up supporting this new southern Vietnamese government, and while Ho Chi Minh is going to end up running the north part of Vietnam. So Eisenhower refused to send troops to help out, but we do send lots of money and aid for the South Vietnamese government. So from 1955 until 1961, when Eisenhower leaves office, we're giving lots of money and aid in the forms of weapons and so forth to help out the South Vietnamese government after the French had lost it. So let's see. So in the north, Ho Chi Minh establishes a communist dictatorship. In the south, No Dinh Diem leads a government that was anti-communist, but it wasn't democratic. Basically, No Dinh Diem, this man right here, you can see, so this is Ho Chi Minh, this is No Dinh Diem here. Ho Chi Minh's name's right here, No Dinh Diem's right here. So he's going to be the leader of the South, but basically he's also a dictator. So No Dinh Diem becomes this dictator of South Vietnam in 1956 or so. What was supposed to happen, according to the Geneva Accords, was that the split was supposed to be temporary. In 2 years, in 1956, both sides of Vietnam were supposed to decide to have a vote and decide what they would become as a country and reunite. But No Dinh Diem decides not to hold the elections because it seems very unlikely that it was going to go his favor. And America basically backs him up on this too. America decides to not press for the elections either and continue to give aid to South Vietnam. So No Dinh Diem, as its dictator, decides not to hold the elections. We continue to give money and supplies to South Vietnam to keep this guy in power as a result. So No Dinh Diem was anti-communist, but he was also Catholic and an urban supporter, so which means he didn't give a lot of support to the rural areas. So that election was never held in 56 because most people thought the communist side would win. Between 1955 and 1961, the U.S. government gave over $1 billion in economic and military aid. So between 1955 and 1961, the U.S. gave over $1 billion in economic and military aid to South Vietnam to help try to create a stable government. Eisenhower justified all this with the domino theory. So this is something you need to be aware of. The domino theory is a term that Eisenhower creates, and it applies to Southeast Asia. So Eisenhower was worried that if Vietnam became communist, like all this became communist, it would create this trickle effect, which would make Laos and Cambodia a communist country, then Thailand, then Burma, then Malaya, then India. It could spread all the way down to Australia. So Eisenhower was worried about this domino theory that could happen here in Southeast Asia. So he coins that phrase in the mid-50s about Southeast Asia and Vietnam, fearing that if we let Vietnam go communist, it's going to make all these other areas in Southeast Asia, even down to Australia, become communist too, which would violate, of course, our ideas about communism and containment. So that's one of the reasons why we stay involved in Vietnam until the 1960s. So no war yet for us. We're helping out South Vietnam stay stabilized, but no war yet. But just know that No Dinh Diem's government was very abusive and not great to his people. But we'll come back and see what happens with the Vietnam War in Unit 12. So the last thing that happens is that in 1954, we do a similar thing to NATO and make another alliance called SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. So the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, is formed here in the mid-50s as another way to try to contain communism. NATO was a way to contain communism in Europe, but we helped form SEATO here in the mid-50s to help contain communism in Southeast Asia, trying to stop it from happening like Laos and Cambodia. This was put together by Dulles, the Secretary of State. So 8 nations formed it. You don't need to know all the nations, but I'm going to tell you the nations that were involved in this. The U.S., Britain, British, the French, Australians, New Zealand, the Philippines, Thailand, and Pakistan all formed SEATO. SEATO no longer exists today, but at the time, for about 20 years or so, it's effective in trying to curtail communism spreading in Southeast Asia. So that's it for Asia at the time. We're going to come back to the Vietnam War in the next unit, but I just want to kind of set the stage up here for you, what's going to be happening here soon. All right, so we're looking at other Cold War issues with under Eisenhower and looking at the Middle East. So the U.S. had a difficult time balancing its ties to oil-rich Arab states and keeping allies with Israel. So back up a little bit here. America's been trying to invest in these oil countries in the Middle East since the 1920s. However, after World War II, Israel was formed as a country. So you don't have to write all this down because it's not really important for the U.S. history test. But just know that after World War II, because of centuries of hurtful things happening to the Jews and so forth, and the Holocaust happening in World War II, a lot of people felt compelled to help the Jews form a country because they hadn't had one since the Roman times, like 2,000 years ago. So the United Nations, in response to the Holocaust, formed a Jewish homeland in the Middle East in 1948. The problem was that it also carved away territory from the Palestinians. Basically, the Palestinians and the Jewish people believed that they should own the same land. So they had to split Jerusalem, and Palestine and Israel became two separate areas in what is now Israel today. Palestine was never officially a country, but Israel was made a country. So we supported Israel, but all these Arab countries around Israel felt like it didn't belong, and it felt like it should go to the Palestinians, which are Muslims, Muslim Arabs. And so there was a lot of resentment created. So a lot of Middle Easterners resented America as a result and didn't want us there and didn't want us involved in Israel, which is why Israel still exists today, which is why they have so much issues, because America supports its existence. But Israel's only been around since the 1940s. So, long story short, a lot of Middle Easterners are upset with us because we support Israel and have supported them since the late 40s when it formed as a country, which means they don't really appreciate us that much whenever we get involved in our situations. Which brings us to the Suez Crisis. So, the guy who was leading Egypt in the mid-50s was a general named General Nasser. So, General Nasser was the guy who was leading Egypt in the mid-1950s. He wanted to create this Aswan Dam. Like, he wanted to create this dam project on the Nile River. So the dam itself was going to be called the Aswan, A-S-W-A-N, dam. It would be built on the Nile River. He wanted America to help fund it. So the U.S. refused because Egypt had been a threat to Israel recently. So Egypt had been an enemy of Israel. They asked us for money to help build this dam, and basically we said no. The Soviets, they also try to ask the Soviets at the same time, wanting more funds. So they try to play us both off each other, and they also ask the Soviets to give funding as well too. But when we found out the Soviets were involved, we backed out. When the Soviets found out we were involved, they backed out. And so basically he was stuck. So Nasser was stuck. And he needed more funding. He needed funding from somewhere to help pay for this dam this dam project he wanted to build in his home country, which is where the Suez Canal comes in. The Suez Canal runs through Egypt, and the Suez Canal functioned kind of like the Panama Canal does. The Suez Canal connects the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, so it cuts down travel time. As opposed to going all the way down and around Africa, you have the Suez Canal built right here that connects the Mediterranean through the Red Sea. Except the Egyptians don't actually control the Suez Canal. It's controlled by the British. The British had taken control of it as a protectorate territory in the 1800s, and so the British controlled the Suez Canal, kind of like how we control the Panama Canal. So in 1956, the Egyptians, upset with what's happened with us and with the Soviets, seized control of the Suez Canal. So they seized control of the Suez Canal away from the British and create this international crisis. So the British want it back. So the British decided to basically put together ships and they get allies with the French and the Israelis. So the British, the French, and the Israelis are going to decide to send forces into Egypt to try to go re-seize control of the Suez Canal, which might spark this big fight and big war if it goes forward. So you're like, well, what does that have to do with America? America withdrew out of all this. Why are we involved? Well, we didn't want this international crisis to happen, and so Eisenhower is very upset by what's happening here in the Suez Crisis. So he appeals to the United Nations. Eisenhower goes to the United Nations, and through the United Nations, they decide to basically request the British and the French stand down. So they request the British, French, and Israelis stand down and stop trying to reclaim the Suez Canal as a result. Because if the Suez Canal was held up, it would cut off the Western Hemisphere's oil supply. That's why we were so concerned here, too, is that if this canal shut down, it would interfere with the Western supplies line of oil shipments from the Middle East. So Eisenhower was mad because he was kept in the dark when all this happened. So after we put pressure on them, they withdrew. So the British, the French, and the Israelis withdrew out of the Suez Canal. So no fighting ever happened. But the whole significance of all this is that it shows American prestige. America demonstrates that it has more influence and more international prestige over other countries through the United Nations and so forth than the British and French have before the war. So it kind of shows how World War II was a very pivotal turning point in American history, where before the war, America was not that big of an international player, but after the war, now it is, and it has more influence than traditional powers of England and France as a result. So England and France back down and will no longer intervene in the Suez Crisis. So the Egyptians keep control of the Suez Canal crisis, but it's kind of, this whole thing is just kind of more of a Cold War situation, as well as a, hey, this is what America is actually like now. So I'm going to stop this video here, and then we'll move on to video 2.